In the center of a vast aircraft hangar, the silver trident on Silas Kane's lapel had gone dark with age, but Rear Admiral Vance Harlan only glanced at it once before laughing out loud in front of the entire gathering. He called the old veteran a fraud, ordered the pin torn from his jacket, and threatened to have the tall black man in handcuffs if he dared mention the word seal again. Silas didn't argue. He simply asked whether Harlan had the courage to open a sealed file that carried the name Gray Harbor. A moment later, the massive hangar doors rolled open. Dozens of Navy SEALs marched inside, snapped to attention in perfect unison, and raised their hands in salute to the quiet man standing at the center of the room. If you love stories where honor gets trampled and then handed back in full, tap subscribe now and stay with this one all the way to the end. The unveiling ceremony for the new Aegis Lift rescue system had drawn hundreds of officers, engineers, contractors, and invited guests into one of the largest aircraft hangars on North Island just across the water from Coronado. Enormous banners hung from the steel rafters, each one proclaiming the arrival of a new era for Special Operations Forces. And at the center of the polished concrete floor sat the rescue winch itself, a machine worth tens of millions of dollars built by Wexford Maritime Systems. Silas arrived alone, dressed in a faded navy blue suit that had clearly seen better decades, with nothing on his lapel but that single tarnished trident. He wore no medals, no ribbons, no lanyard identifying rank or unit, nothing that would suggest to a stranger that he had once commanded men into places most people were never meant to know existed. The young woman checking names at the entrance searched twice and found nothing under Kane, though the invitation in his hand carried the official seal of the Office of the Vice Chief of Naval Operations along with a security code she had never seen before. A junior officer waved him through anyway, but Harlan's aide spotted the old man crossing the threshold and ordered him held at the door until his credentials could be verified. Silas didn't push back. He simply stood among the pressed uniforms and polished shoes, absorbing the sideways glances and the murmured remarks about a man dressed like a hired driver wearing a Navy SEAL trident on his chest. When Harlan finally arrived, flanked by Maxwell Crowe and a small cluster of reporters, he noticed the holdup near the entrance and walked over out of curiosity more than concern. His eyes moved slowly down Silas from head to toe before landing on the small silver emblem, and something about the stranger's stillness convinced him he had found an easy target for the cameras. Harlan raised his arm, pointed directly at the trident, and asked loud enough for half the hangar to hear where exactly a man like that had purchased something so obviously fake. The ceremony had been months in the planning, and every detail around the hangar reflected that effort, from the polished floor tiles to the rows of folding chairs arranged in perfect lines facing the stage. Local officials mingled with contractors near a table stacked with programs printed on heavy cardstock, each one featuring a glossy photograph of the Aegis lift system beneath bold lettering promising a safer future for rescue operations at sea. A brass quartet had been hired to play quietly near the entrance, filling the vast space with music meant to lend the occasion a sense of ceremony and weight. Maxwell Crowe had personally overseen the seating chart, ensuring investors and political allies sat closest to the stage, while lower-ranking officers were pushed toward the back rows near the walls. None of that arrangement accounted for a man who arrived without an entourage, without a title anyone recognized, and without the polish that had come to define who belonged in rooms like this one. Silas had seen ceremonies like it before, the kind built more around appearances than substance, and he understood that his quiet presence alone was enough to threaten the carefully constructed image Harlan wanted the cameras to capture. Harlan made sure his voice carried far enough for the officers, the reporters, and the invited families nearby to catch every word, and he demanded Silas produce his unit number, his training class, and the name of his very first commanding officer. Silas answered calmly that part of his record belonged to a classified program known only as Gray Harbor. That single phrase caught the attention of Captain Elise Marin, who had once seen the words Gray Harbor buried inside a heavily redacted report, but had never learned who had actually been involved. Harlan decided the mysterious name was simply a convenient shield for a man trying to dodge verification, and he mocked the very idea of someone claiming to have served on missions nobody was ever permitted to discuss. Maxwell Crowe chimed in with a smirk, suggesting the stranger was likely a former groundskeeper or maintenance worker who had picked up military jargon from years spent wandering the edges of the base. Harlan's bias showed in the way he kept referring to Silas as this man rather than using his name, as though a real Navy SEAL veteran would surely arrive with a polished reputation, powerful friends, and a spot on some honor roll everyone could recognize. Silas remained composed throughout the questioning and explained quietly that the trident was never meant to be jewelry, but a promise shared only among those who had walked through the same brutal door together. Harlan shot back that anyone truly deserving of the emblem wouldn't need such poetic language to justify wearing it. He ordered a nearby security officer to run the stranger's name through the personnel database in front of everyone, expecting the search to return nothing but silence. Instead, the screen displayed a single line that should have stopped the entire confrontation in its tracks. A message reading restricted file, special access program clearance required. Rather than pausing to consider what that meant, Harlan dismissed it outright as a database glitch or some outdated civilian record accidentally flagged by the system. He then instructed Silas to remove the Trident himself before security did it for him. A few of the officers standing nearby exchanged uneasy glances, sensing that the confrontation had already crossed a line most of them wouldn't have dared approach on their own. One senior chief quietly suggested to a colleague that the restricted file notice deserved more attention than Harlan seemed willing to give it, though neither man spoke loudly enough for the admiral to hear. Maxwell Crowe, meanwhile, used the pause to remind everyone within earshot that impersonating a veteran was a serious offense, framing his outrage as concern for the integrity of the entire ceremony rather than simple theater for the cameras. Silas listened to all of it without flinching, his hands loosely folded in front of him, betraying none of the tension building beneath his calm exterior. He had faced far worse than public suspicion during his years of service, and a room full of strangers questioning his integrity was a small price compared to what he had already paid to keep his silence for so long. Captain Marin watched the exchange with growing unease, aware that something about the entire situation felt fundamentally wrong, even if she couldn't yet articulate exactly what it was. She had spent enough years around genuine imposters to recognize the nervous overcompensation that usually accompanied a false claim, the eagerness to fill silence with elaborate detail meant to distract from gaps in the story. Silas displayed none of those tendencies, answering only what was asked and offering nothing more, a pattern she associated far more often with men who had actually lived through the things they described than with those inventing a history to impress a crowd. "If you take it off me," Silas said quietly, "be prepared to explain that decision to the men who gave it back to me." Harlan noticed the cameras rolling nearby and decided the moment offered the perfect opportunity to present himself as the guardian of the Navy's honor rather than simply a man losing his patience. He ordered a makeshift interrogation space set up beside the main stage, positioning Silas directly in front of hundreds of onlookers while two security officers hovered a few steps behind him. Harlan launched into a speech about his family's long history of naval service, tracing it back through his grandfather and father before declaring that imposters wearing stolen honors were an insult to every family who had lost someone in uniform. The words themselves weren't wrong, but Harlan twisted them into a weapon aimed squarely at a man he hadn't bothered to actually investigate. Several guests raised their phones to record the scene, and Maxwell Crowe quietly suggested handing the old man over to military police before he could tarnish the reputation of the ceremony any further. Captain Marin asked Harlan to wait for confirmation from a higher authority before taking further action, but he brushed her off with a curt reminder that she served under his command at this event. Harlan picked up the trident between two fingers without yet tearing it from the jacket, pointing out that the silver had dulled. One wing bore a visible scratch, and the overall shape looked nothing like the polished pins displayed behind glass in his own office. Silas replied simply that the trident had spent long hours submerged in open water once, which was why it no longer gleamed the way Harlan expected honors to look. A strange hush fell across the hangar for a moment, though Harlan assumed the old man was simply inventing another dramatic detail to sound convincing, and he laughed as he asked whether Silas planned to claim he had single-handedly rescued an entire SEAL platoon. Silas didn't take credit for anything of the sort. He only answered that no one from Gray Harbor had ever come home alone. While the exchange continued, Elise quietly instructed an aide to check the security code printed on Silas's invitation, and the results confirmed the invitation was authentic. Yet, his name had been deleted from the official guest list the previous evening by an account tied directly to Harlan's office. Moments later, Elise received a second notification that changed the entire shape of the confrontation, one confirming that Silas hadn't come to the ceremony as an ordinary guest at all, but as an independent safety evaluator brought in to inspect the very machine sitting at the center of the stage. Elise pulled Harlan aside and explained that the invitation carried authority that outranked whatever list his event planning staff had assembled. Harlan refused to back down, insisting that an invitation alone proved nothing about whether this stranger had ever actually served as a SEAL, and he certainly hadn't earned the right to interrupt a ceremony this important. Silas finally revealed the real reason for his presence, explaining that he had studied the technical drawings for Aegis Lift and noticed the load-bearing latch shared a troubling resemblance to a mechanism that had failed catastrophically decades earlier during the Gray Harbor mission. He warned that if the system were tested anywhere near maximum capacity, the locking mechanism could deform under stress, allowing the rescue cable to slip free of its housing at the worst possible moment. Maxwell Crowe immediately pushed back, insisting the device had passed every internal test his engineering teams had run, and he accused Silas of deliberately trying to sabotage a contract worth a fortune to his company. Harlan demanded to know what authority a man no longer serving in uniform could possibly claim over technology valued at tens of millions of dollars. Silas produced a sealed envelope bearing the signature of Vice Admiral Tessa Harlow, but Harlan refused to open it, instead handing it off to an aide with a promise to review the contents sometime after the ceremony concluded. That single choice revealed exactly where his priorities sat, since he clearly cared more about keeping the schedule intact than addressing a documented safety concern from someone with legitimate standing to raise it. Harlan warned that the demonstration would proceed exactly as planned and ordered security to escort the stranger away from the immediate area around the stage. He went further still, suggesting out loud that Silas was simply another aging veteran unable to accept that his era had passed, using a fabricated secret history to feel important again in front of a crowd. Those words cut deeper than anything said before them, because Silas had spent years staying silent specifically to protect the identities of the men he had served alongside. And now that very silence was being twisted into evidence against him. Somewhere near the back of the crowd, a young petty officer who had recently joined the base watched the entire exchange with growing discomfort, unable to reconcile the calm dignity of the man being accused with the picture Harlan kept painting of a desperate imposter. She had heard whispers among senior enlisted personnel about a legendary figure connected to a mission called Gray Harbor, though nobody ever offered details. And something about the stranger's composure made her wonder if the rumors and the man standing before her were somehow connected. Harlan, oblivious to the doubt spreading through pockets of the crowd, pressed forward with growing confidence, certain that his family name and decades of visible rank gave him more credibility than a man who refused to raise his voice even once. He reminded everyone nearby that trust in the uniform depended on holding pretenders accountable, insisting that letting this moment pass without consequence would dishonor every service member who had ever earned their place through legitimate sacrifice. What Harlan failed to grasp was that the very composure he mistook for guilt was in fact the discipline of a man who had spent his career choosing silence over self-promotion. Maxwell Crowe tried a different approach, appealing to Harlan's ambition rather than his pride, and quietly reminded him that a public delay caused by an unverified stranger could easily be spun into a story about excessive caution rather than genuine risk. Harlan liked that framing far better than the idea of admitting any uncertainty in front of reporters who had already begun drafting headlines about the historic new rescue system. He straightened his jacket, waved off the sealed envelope one final time, and announced to the gathered crowd that the demonstration would begin exactly on schedule, regardless of any unverified claims from an outsider. Silas didn't argue further, recognizing that Harlan had already decided which version of events he intended to believe long before any evidence could change his mind. Instead, Silas quietly stepped closer to the safety perimeter marked in yellow paint along the hangar floor, positioning himself where he could watch the machine's telemetry readouts without obstruction. Before security could lead him away, Silas glanced once more at the massive machine and said quietly that the locking latch would begin to bend at a critical percentage of rated load. As the security officers moved to escort Silas out of the demonstration area, the low rumble of approaching vehicles rolled through the open bay doors at the far end of the hangar. The enormous steel doors began sliding apart, flooding the space with afternoon light as a full SEAL platoon returning from a training exercise marched inside in tight formation, led by Master Chief Amos Carver. Harlan smiled the moment he saw them arrive, certain that a group of active duty SEALs would happily confirm his suspicions and finish exposing the imposter once and for all. He called Amos over, gestured toward the tarnished Trident, and demanded the Master Chief state plainly whether the pin was genuine or nothing more than a cheap imitation. Amos's eyes landed on Silas, and he froze mid-stride, his gaze drifting from the worn silver emblem to the weathered face of the man who had pulled him out of danger years earlier. Silas gave the smallest shake of his head, a silent request that Amos not break the vow of discretion the two of them had carried for so many years. Harlan misread the hesitation entirely, announcing that the stranger had clearly been caught in his lie and instructing Amos to strip the pin from his jacket personally to preserve the honor of the entire community. Amos didn't move to obey. Instead, he turned toward the platoon still standing behind him and called out sharply for the men to snap to attention. Dozens of SEALs froze instantly, and a heavy silence settled across the enormous hangar as every eye turned toward the small group near the stage. Amos stepped forward until he stood directly in front of Silas, looked him in the eye, and addressed him by his full rank and name, Commander Silas Kane. He raised his right hand and held a formal salute. One by one, recognition swept through the formation behind him. The younger operators, who had never personally met Silas, still knew the story passed down through their unit's history. The legend of a commander known only as Rook, who had refused to abandon the extraction point at Gray Harbor, no matter the cost. At Amos's signal, every SEAL in the hangar raised their hand in salute toward Silas at the same moment. Not a single one turned toward Harlan. News cameras captured the entire scene, recording the image of a powerful admiral standing frozen in the middle of dozens of raised arms. Every one of them pointed toward the very man he had just publicly branded a fraud only minutes earlier. Amos lowered his hand at last and turned back to Harlan, his voice steady but unmistakably firm. Admiral, roughly half the men standing in this hangar are alive today because of decisions he made, Amos said. The words landed with a weight that seemed to physically press against Harlan's shoulders, and for the first time since the confrontation began, he had no immediate response ready. Reporters near the stage lowered their phones slightly, no longer certain whether they were witnessing the unmasking of a fraud or the humiliation of an admiral who had misjudged the situation entirely. Several of the younger SEALs in formation exchanged quiet glances, their earlier uncertainty replaced by something closer to pride, as though they had just been given permission to openly honor a name they had only ever heard spoken in hushed tones during training briefings. Elise watched Harlan's expression shift from irritation to something closer to alarm, the realization slowly dawning on him that his carefully staged ceremony had just become a very different kind of story. Silas remained still through all of it, neither basking in the recognition nor rushing to explain himself further, content to let the truth surface on its own terms rather than forcing it into the spotlight. Harlan tried to regain control of the situation by insisting that an emotional display, however impressive, couldn't override official records. Amos requested that the newly declassified file authorized under Vice Admiral Harlow's signature be pulled up on the nearest system, and Captain Marin used the access granted through the sealed envelope Silas had carried since arriving. The massive screen behind the stage, originally intended to display marketing footage for Aegis Lift, switched instead to a naval document with entire sections newly unredacted for the occasion. Gray Harbor had never been a straightforward strike mission at all, but a desperate rescue operation launched after a helicopter recovery system failed and left an entire special operations team stranded behind enemy lines. Silas, then a lieutenant commander, made the decision to abandon the primary intelligence objective entirely in order to focus every remaining resource on pulling his stranded men to safety. That single choice saved many lives, though it also meant a critical intelligence target slipped away and was never recovered. To protect the sources who had provided sensitive information and to avoid revealing operational methods that were still active elsewhere, Silas allowed the public record to state only that he had been removed from the mission due to what it called a tactical misjudgment. The classified version of that same file told an entirely different story, identifying his decision as the single factor that prevented catastrophic losses across the entire unit. The document continued with details few in the hangar had ever imagined existed, describing how the original recovery mechanism failed within minutes of the extraction beginning, stranding the team in hostile terrain with dwindling supplies and no functioning communication relay. Silas had spent long hours coordinating an alternate extraction route entirely from memory, relying on terrain he had studied only once during a preparatory briefing weeks earlier. 2 men in his unit suffered serious injuries during the improvised recovery, and the file noted that Silas personally carried one of them nearly a mile across broken ground after the man's leg gave out beneath him. None of that appeared anywhere in the public record, which instead offered only a brief misleading note about tactical misjudgment that had followed Silas quietly through the remainder of his career. He never corrected the record himself, choosing instead to let the misunderstanding stand rather than risk exposing operational details that could still endanger people connected to the mission even decades later. Several of the older SEALs standing in formation had heard fragments of the story before, passed down through late-night conversations during long deployments, but none of them had ever seen the full declassified account laid out in black and white on a screen for everyone to witness. One veteran chief petty officer lowered his head briefly, overcome by the realization that the man he had quietly admired from a distance for years had been standing only a few feet away the entire afternoon. Amos continued speaking, describing how Silas had refused every opportunity afterward to correct the record publicly, even when doing so might have advanced his own career considerably faster than it ultimately did. That refusal, Amos explained, wasn't born of humility alone, but of a deeper conviction that protecting the people who trusted him mattered more than protecting his own name. Amos explained that Silas had been the very last man to leave the extraction point, and that the scratch marring the Trident had come from using its own attachment cord to keep a failing piece of rescue equipment from tearing completely apart. Silas tried to steer attention away from himself, insisting that many others had held their positions that night as well, and that some of them had never been able to return to active service afterward because of what the mission had cost them. The declassified file also confirmed that Silas had quietly received the Navy Cross during a private ceremony and that he had personally requested his identity remain hidden since several people connected to Gray Harbor could still become targets if the operations details ever became public. Harlan began to realize the scale of his mistake, understanding now that he hadn't merely embarrassed some anonymous veteran in front of a crowd, but had publicly accused one of the most respected officers ever produced by the special operations community. Maxwell Crowe quietly tried to slip away from the immediate area, only to find Elise blocking his path with a look that made clear he wasn't going anywhere. A fresh page appeared within the Gray Harbor file, one detailing the technical cause of the original equipment failure, and the alloy specifications listed there matched almost exactly the material currently sitting inside the Aegis lift locking mechanism. Vice Admiral Tessa Harlow walked into the hangar, accompanied by representatives from the Office of the Naval Inspector General, having arrived earlier than originally scheduled after learning that Silas's safety review had somehow been delayed without explanation. She confirmed publicly that she herself had personally invited Silas to attend, choosing him specifically because of his first-hand understanding of the recovery system's troubled history and because he held no financial stake whatsoever in the contract under review. Elise presented evidence showing that Silas's name had appeared correctly on the official guest roster right up until the previous evening, when it was quietly removed by an account traced directly back to Harlan's own office. Harlan tried blaming a junior aide for what he called a clerical error, but the system logs told a different story, showing his personal credentials had authorized the change without any ambiguity. A separate email surfaced during the same review, one in which Maxwell Crowe warned Harlan weeks earlier that Silas might raise objections about the company's decision to substitute a cheaper alloy in place of the material specified in the original contract. Harlan had responded in writing that some nameless old veteran wasn't going to be allowed to derail either the ceremony or the deal behind it. Harlow turned to Harlan directly and asked why he had felt comfortable calling a man's Trident fake when the security system clearly displayed a record tied to a special access clearance most officers never even see. Harlan fell back on the excuse that he had only been protecting the Navy's reputation, but Harlow reminded him firmly that protecting an institution's honor never justified condemning a man based on his appearance, his modest bearing, or his lack of powerful connections. Silas never accused Harlan outright of prejudice, choosing instead to ask a simpler question, wondering aloud whether Harlan would have treated a man with a famous surname, an expensive suit, and an entourage of assistants the exact same way. Harlan had no answer for that. The silence that followed stretched long enough to become its own kind of verdict, settling over the crowd more heavily than any of Harlan's earlier declarations had managed to. Harlow let the moment breathe before continuing, reminding everyone present that the Navy's credibility depended on treating every service member with the same baseline respect, regardless of how polished or plain they happened to appear at any given ceremony. A few of the visiting officials shifted uncomfortably in their seats, clearly reassessing everything they had witnessed over the past hour through a very different lens. Elise noticed Maxwell Crowe inching toward the side exit again, and this time she didn't bother pulling him aside gently, instead instructing a nearby security officer to keep him within sight until the Inspector General's team arrived to take formal statements. Maxwell Crowe attempted to frame the entire confrontation as nothing more than a personal misunderstanding, but Silas steered the conversation firmly back toward the matter that actually mattered, reminding everyone that Aegis Lift was still scheduled to undergo a full load demonstration within the hour. Harlow ordered the test halted immediately, and Harlan objected loudly, arguing that canceling the demonstration now would cause significant financial damage and embarrass the entire Navy in front of watching cameras. Silas answered simply that reputations could always be rebuilt over time, but a life lost during a preventable failure could never be given back. Just as Harlow gave the order to cut power to the system, the Aegis Lift rig began its pre-programmed test sequence entirely on its own, the automated cycle already locked in and impossible to interrupt from where they stood. The massive winch began hoisting a multi-ton rescue mannequin off the hangar floor. As the automated sequence played out exactly as scheduled, the immediate test zone had been cleared of personnel earlier that day. Though several engineers remained stationed only a short distance away to monitor the readouts, Harlan wanted the cycle to continue uninterrupted, still convinced that a flawless demonstration might somehow salvage his reputation and prove that Silas had grossly exaggerated the danger. Silas watched closely, listening to the pitch of the motor, the tension running through the main cable, and the numbers climbing steadily across the pressure display. Once the load crossed a critical percentage of rated capacity, he ordered everyone still standing nearby to retreat immediately behind the marked safety line. Maxwell Crowe insisted the system had been rated to withstand far beyond maximum load without issue, prompting Silas to ask pointedly whether that figure had actually been verified using the alloy specified in the contract or the cheaper substitute currently installed inside the housing. When the display reached the threshold Silas had warned about, a faint metallic groan rippled through the massive steel frame overhead. By the time it climbed further, the locking latch began to bend exactly the way Silas had predicted only minutes earlier. He didn't panic. Instead, he calmly instructed the engineering team to reduce the load in careful stages rather than cutting power all at once, warning that an abrupt shutdown could cause the emergency brake to lock into the wrong position and make the failure significantly worse. Harlan shouted for the entire machine to be shut down immediately. But Silas overruled him on the spot and told Elise not to follow that order, creating a tense standoff over who actually held authority in that critical moment. Harlow stepped in and formally handed technical control of the situation to Silas without hesitation. Drawing on lessons carried since Gray Harbor, he guided the load down slowly onto a secondary support cradle position beneath the rig. The latch finally gave way completely, just as the mannequin settled close to the ground, and the mechanical arm swung briefly into an empty testing platform, but no one anywhere near the equipment was harmed. A jagged piece of broken metal skidded across the concrete floor and came to rest almost directly at Harlan's feet. For a few seconds after the mechanical arm finally settled, nobody in the hangar moved or spoke, the only sound coming from the winding down motor and a few scattered gasps from onlookers who had just watched a very expensive piece of machinery nearly fail in front of hundreds of witnesses. Engineers rushed forward to inspect the housing, calling out readings to one another while photographing the twisted remains of the latch before anyone could think to move it. Captain Marin ordered the immediate area cordoned off, aware that whatever had just happened would need to be documented precisely for the investigation that was clearly coming next. Harlow stood quietly beside Silas, watching him work through the shutdown sequence with the same unhurried focus he had shown throughout the entire confrontation, as though diffusing a near disaster were simply another item on a long list of things he had done many times before. Amos picked up the fragment and turned it over in his hand, revealing a stamped material code that didn't match the specifications listed anywhere in the official contract. Maxwell Crowe's face drained of color, and Harlan looked over at him, suddenly realizing that his business partner appeared ready to abandon him entirely rather than share the blame. Silas didn't celebrate the moment or gloat over being proven right. He simply looked at the damaged rig and remarked quietly that Gray Harbor had issued this exact warning years earlier. Yet, pride had nearly allowed the very same mistake to repeat itself in front of hundreds of witnesses. Investigators from the Inspector General's office ordered the entire rig sealed off from further use and demanded immediate access to every message exchanged between Harlan and Crowe over the preceding months. Once the immediate danger had passed, Harlan tried shifting all responsibility onto Wexford Maritime Systems, claiming he had simply trusted the technical assurances provided by the contractor. Maxwell Crowe fired back instantly, revealing that Harlan had personally pressured the company to finish the system ahead of schedule, so he could tout the achievement before an upcoming promotion review board. The recovered messages showed clearly that Harlan had known an independent verification round remained incomplete. Yet, he still signed off on the demonstration and privately promised to help Crowe secure additional contracts if the ceremony went smoothly. Harlan then attempted to turn the blame toward Elise, accusing her of mismanaging the base, but she produced a stack of prior safety reports she had submitted, each one returned by Harlan's office, marked as unnecessary or premature. Silas had every opportunity to humiliate Harlan further in front of the assembled reporters. Yet, he chose not to take it, instead requesting that the cameras be turned off while junior personnel were questioned so none of them would be unfairly caught in the fallout. Harlow announced that Harlan would be relieved of his command authority for the duration of the investigation, requiring him to surrender his access credentials, step away from the stage entirely, and avoid any further contact with witnesses involved in the case. Maxwell Crowe was detained separately to answer questions about the fraudulent substitution of materials, and the entire Aegis Lift contract was frozen indefinitely, placing both his company's finances and its reputation in serious jeopardy. News of the frozen contract spread quickly through the assembled crowd, and several investors who had arrived, hoping to celebrate a lucrative new partnership, began quietly gathering their belongings and heading toward the exits instead. A junior aide who had once worked directly under Harlan approached Elise privately, admitting that she had raised concerns about the rushed timeline months earlier, but had been told in no uncertain terms to keep her objections to herself. Elise assured her that the investigation would take every account seriously and that no one who came forward honestly would face retaliation for speaking up now that the truth had finally surfaced. Elsewhere in the hangar, Amos quietly organized his platoon to help clear the demonstration area, giving the younger operators something productive to do while the adults sorted through the wreckage of what had started as a celebration. As Harlan passed by Silas on his way out of the hangar, he tried one last time to appear unbothered, asking whether Silas felt satisfied watching an admiral's career collapse in front of everyone. Silas answered plainly that he hadn't come there to destroy anyone's career, and that Harlan had done that to himself the moment he decided his own reputation mattered more than another person's safety. Harlan glanced once more at the worn Trident he had called fake only hours earlier, and for the first time it seemed to represent everything he had never truly understood about loyalty or sacrifice. Before leaving, Harlow offered Silas the opportunity to return to active involvement with the Navy as head of a newly formed safety review board, though he didn't answer her right away. After the initial phase of the investigation wrapped up, Silas stood alone beside a display case dedicated to the history of naval special warfare. A curtain nearby was drawn back to reveal an old photograph of the Gray Harbor team taken long before any of this had happened. In the picture, a younger version of Silas stood near the back row, almost out of frame entirely, which had always been his instinct throughout his career, staying out of the spotlight while quietly carrying the weight when everything else fell apart. Amos walked over and asked why Silas had never bothered correcting the public record about being removed from that long ago mission. Silas replied that the people who truly mattered had always known the truth, and for most of his life that had felt like enough. Still, he admitted that staying silent for so long had left an open space for men like Harlan to rewrite history however it suited them best. He agreed to lead the new safety board for a single term, but only under 3 conditions he insisted on setting himself. Junior engineers needed to be able to report safety concerns without fear of retaliation from anyone above them. Every material substitution on future contracts required independent verification before approval. And the recognition owed to the entire Gray Harbor team needed to be restored, not just his own name alone. Harlow agreed to all 3 without hesitation. Word of the agreement traveled quickly through the base in the days that followed, and several engineers who had once been afraid to flag potential defects began submitting reports through the newly established channel almost immediately. Elise oversaw the first round of independent material verifications herself, personally signing off on each one before it reached Silas for final review. Maxwell Crow's company faced a lengthy federal inquiry into the substituted alloy, and industry analysts speculated openly about whether Wexford Maritime Systems would survive the scandal at all. Harlan's case moved slowly through a formal review board, and though the final outcome would take months to resolve, the footage from the hangar had already traveled far beyond the base, prompting uncomfortable questions from lawmakers about how such a dangerous system had come so close to full deployment. Before leaving the hangar for good, Silas walked past the assembled SEAL platoon one final time, and Amos asked whether the unit could finally hold the formal honor ceremony that Gray Harbor had never been given all those years ago. Silas didn't want anything elaborate. He asked only that the names of the other men be read aloud before his own. Once the list had been read in full, Amos called the platoon to attention one more time, and every SEAL present raised a hand in salute to Commander Silas Kane for the second time that day. Silas returned the salute quietly. Sunlight spilling through the open hangar doors caught the old Trident on his lapel, still scratched, still dulled with age. Nothing like the flawless pins locked safely behind glass in what used to be Harlan's office. This time, though, not a single person standing in that hangar doubted what it was worth. Silas walked out without an entourage, without a prepared statement for the cameras, and without accepting any of the honors people tried pressing on him afterward. He carried only the Trident and one final truth with him as he left. A symbol never earns its value from the metal used to shape it. It earns that value from the people who once stood beside each other when everything else in the world was falling apart. Years later, those who had stood inside that hangar still spoke of the afternoon in careful, almost reverent terms, describing the moment an entire platoon turned as one to honor a man nobody had been willing to believe only hours before. The story spread slowly through the ranks, told and retold at training briefings and quiet mess hall conversations, always ending the same way, with a reminder that rank and appearance were never reliable measures of a person's true worth. Harlan's name faded from conversation almost entirely, remembered mostly as a cautionary example rather than anything resembling the legacy he had once hoped to build. Silas, by contrast, never sought out the attention that followed him afterward, preferring instead to spend his mornings walking along the water near the base. The old Trident still fastened quietly to whatever jacket he happened to be wearing that day. It remained scratched, still faded by salt and time, and he never once considered replacing it with something newer or more polished, because to him it had never needed to shine in order to mean everything it did.